The folder had sat on that desk for 22 years. Gerald Howarth had bought it at a stationer's in Exeter during a church conference in 1931, or thereabouts, and it had followed him faithfully through 3 parishes before landing here in St. Mary Mead, where it held his letters, his notes, his half-finished thoughts on Scripture, and occasionally a pressed flower that Dorothy had set there because she thought it looked as lonely. The leather was cracked along one edge. The brass clasp no longer closed properly. He had meant to replace it every year for the past decade and never had, because replacing it would have felt like admitting that time moved. On Tuesday the 14th of November, he came back from his afternoon walk, the short one, only as far as the Lich Gate and back, or because his knee had been troubling him. And the folder was gone. He stood in the doorway of his study for quite a long moment. The desk looked wrong without it. That was his first thought, not where is it or who took it, but simply that the desk looked wrong, the way a face looks wrong when something small but essential has changed, and you can't immediately say what. He walked to the desk. He opened the top drawer, which was where he put things when he was tidying hurriedly and didn't want Dorothy to see the mess. Not there. He opened the second drawer. He looked behind the inkstand and beside the Bible and underneath the blotter, and found nothing but a dried-out pen nib and a button he'd been missing for 3 months. He sat down in his chair. The window was open. He always left it open in the afternoons, even in November, because the study smelled of old paper and he rather liked cold air while he worked. The garden outside was the usual tangle of late autumn brown. The elm by the fence had dropped most of its leaves. A robin sat on the bird bath and regarded him with the particular indifference that robins have. Gerald Howarth looked at the robin for a while. Then he got up, went to the kitchen and told Dorothy that his folder seemed to have gone missing. Dorothy Howarth was a practical woman. She had been a practical woman at 23 when she married him, and she was a practical woman now at 67. And she managed the household and the parish calendar, and her husband's tendency toward gentle absent-mindedness with the same steady competence she brought to everything. She heard what he said. She set down the knife she was using to pare apples. "Oh, gone missing," she said. "It's not on the desk." "You've checked the drawers." "Both of them, and behind the inkstand." She wiped her hands on her apron and went with him to the study and looked. She checked the same places he had checked, and then she checked the bookshelf and the mantelpiece and the floor behind the armchair, and she found the button he'd been missing, which she put in her apron pocket, and she did not find the folder. "Edith must have moved it," she said. "When she cleaned." "Edith cleaned on Monday." "She may have put it somewhere and forgotten to say." "Yes," Gerald said. "Oh, she may have." But he stood in the middle of his study with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that Dorothy recognised, the particular stillness that came over him when something was wrong that he hadn't yet decided how to address. And she did not, in that moment, look at him directly. She looked instead at the empty desk. "I'll ask her tomorrow," she said. "Don't worry about it tonight." He nodded. He seemed about to say something else. He didn't. Dorothy went back to her apples. The news, if it could be called that, which Dorothy would have disputed, reached Miss Marple by Thursday morning through the usual channels. Mrs. Price at the post office had heard it from Edith Cranshaw herself, who had come in for stamps and mentioned that she was in a state because Mrs. Howarth had asked her 3 times whether she'd moved something from the study, and she hadn't, and now she felt she was being blamed for a thing she hadn't done, which was deeply upsetting. Mrs. Price had relayed this to Miss Hartnell, who had mentioned it to the butcher's boy, who had said something to his mother, who had happened to be talking over the garden wall with Miss Marple on Wednesday afternoon about whether the cold snap would last into December. Miss Marple, who was cutting back her roses at the time, had listened. She had made a sympathetic noise about poor Edith being put in a difficult position. She had agreed that the cold snap would very likely last, and she had gone inside and thought about it. She was not, she told herself firmly, a woman who made mountains out of molehills. Sermon notes went missing all the time. An elderly clergyman misplaced things constantly. Gerald Howarth was a dear man, but he had once left his reading glasses in the refrigerator and hadn't noticed for 2 days. There was almost certainly a perfectly ordinary explanation. But the folder had been on that desk for 22 years, and the window had been open, and Edith, who was a thorough woman, somewhat deaf in one ear but thorough, was quite certain she hadn't touched it. Miss Marple finished her tea and went to her larder for the black currant jam. The vicarage was a 10-minute walk from Miss Marple's cottage, through the churchyard and along the lane that smelled of damp stone in November and roses in July. She went on Friday morning when she knew Dorothy would be in. Dorothy was always in on Friday mornings when she did the church flowers. And she brought 2 jars, one for the fate raffle and one as a gift, because arriving with 1 jar looked calculated and arriving with 2 looked generous. Dorothy answered the door herself. She looked, Miss Marple thought, as though she hadn't been sleeping quite as well as usual. There was a tightness around her eyes that she was carrying with considerable dignity and not quite concealing. She said she was delighted to see Miss Marple. She said the black currant jam was too kind. She brought her through to the sitting room where a fire was going and the church flowers from last week were dying decoratively in a vase on the windowsill, and she called through to the kitchen for tea. They talked about the fate. They talked about whether the new drains on Vicarage Lane had solved the flooding problem or merely deferred it. They talked about Mrs. Bantry's cousin, Zeman, who had apparently moved to Devonshire and was finding it very agreeable. Miss Marple's eyes moved, as they always did, steadily and without apparent purpose around the room. The door to the study was ajar. She could see the desk from where she sat, just the edge of it, and the window behind it, grey November light coming through. The desk was tidy. Someone had made it very tidy, the way people tidy things when they are anxious about them. "Is the Reverend at home?" she asked. "Out visiting?" Dorothy's hands, which had been still in her lap, shifted slightly, settled again. "He goes to old Mr. Caswell on Fridays. The poor man can't get to church any more." "So good of him. He is a devoted man." "He is." Dorothy looked at the fire. "He's been a little distracted this week, I'm afraid. He had some notes go missing. For his Christmas sermon, you may have heard." "I had heard something," Miss Marple said, gently vague. "Through Edith, I think, or... No, it may have been Mrs. Price. One does lose track." "It's really nothing to worry about." Dorothy's voice was perfectly steady. Her hands were now folded in her lap again. "He's simply been working very hard on this particular sermon, and he misplaces things. You know how he is." "Of course," Miss Marple smiled. "Though I did think Edith seemed rather upset about it." "Oh, she takes things too much to heart. I told her it was nothing to do with her." A brief pause. "I'm quite certain I'll find the folder soon. It's probably been put somewhere sensible and we've simply overlooked it." "Probably," Miss Marple noted. "Not certainly, and I'll find it. Not we'll find it. Or it'll turn up. The pronoun sitting there like a small stone in still water." She didn't pursue it. She drank her tea and admired the room and asked after the new curate, young Mr. Featherstone, who she hadn't yet had the pleasure of meeting properly. Dorothy's expression did something small and complicated. "He's settling in. He's very enthusiastic." "How nice." "Gerald finds him." She stopped. "He's enthusiastic," she said again. They were talking about the church heating system. A perennial topic of great passion in St. Mary Mead, where opinions on the adequacy of the boiler were held with the same conviction as religious faith. When the front door opened and Curate Featherstone came in. He was perhaps 28, and with a pleasant enough face and the kind of scrubbed clean look that young men have when they are trying very hard to appear trustworthy. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple, and something crossed his face, a flicker of adjustment, a very brief recalibration, before he smiled and was introduced and sat down and accepted a cup of tea with practised ease. He was, Miss Marple thought, a young man who had learned to be charming and found it useful and had not yet noticed that it was a different thing from being genuine. "You've been out visiting?" Dorothy asked him. "Mrs. Armitage," he said without hesitation. "Copper Lane." Miss Marple set down her teacup. She did not say anything. She looked at the curate with mild, friendly attention while he talked about Mrs. Armitage's cold and whether she might need the district nurse. Now, when she thought about the fact that Mrs. Armitage had been in Eastbourne since Monday. She knew this because Mrs. Armitage's niece, Susan, had mentioned it on Tuesday at the post office while posting a package to her aunt, and that Timothy Featherstone had just lied with the fluency of a man who lied easily and didn't expect to be caught. She stayed another 20 minutes. She admired the garden through the window. She went home by way of the side lane, the narrow one that ran between the vicarage wall and the Hendersons' garden, where the study window looked out at ground level, and she walked slowly past it and looked at the flower bed beneath. The soil was soft from last week's rain. There were no footprints. None. She stood there a moment in the cold grey morning, her shopping basket over her arm, looking at the undisturbed earth, or a cat watched her from the wall. If someone had come through that window, reached in, taken the folder from the desk, gone again, they had done it without standing in the flower bed at all, which meant they had very long arms, or they hadn't come through the window, or there had been no one. Miss Marple walked home. She made herself a second cup of tea. She got out her knitting, the blue cardigan for her nephew's youngest, which she'd been meaning to finish since September, and she sat by the window and thought about what she had seen that morning and what she had not seen, which was in some ways more interesting. Dr. Pugh had known Miss Marple for 31 years, which meant he had long since stopped being surprised when she appeared at his door with a question that wasn't quite a question. She came on Saturday morning, when his surgery was closed and he was in the garden doing very little with great concentration, the way men do when they've retired from doing too much and haven't yet learned how to simply sit. He was poking at a rose bush with a stick. The rose bush did not appear to need poking. He looked up when the gate latch clicked, and his expression did the small resigned thing it always did when Miss Marple appeared outside his working hours. "Jane," he said, "Raymond, your rose bush is looking much better than mine. It's dying, actually." "Yes," she agreed pleasantly, "but cheerfully." He let her in. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bolt, brought coffee without being asked. She'd learned over the years that Miss Marple visits meant coffee, and also that they lasted longer than they appeared to at the start. They sat in the front room, all which smelled of pipe tobacco and old medical journals, and Miss Marple looked at the fire, and Dr. Pugh looked at Miss Marple, and they talked for a while about nothing in particular. Then she said, "What do you know about Colonel Finch?" Pugh was quiet for a moment. He tapped his pipe against his knee. "Why?" "Idle curiosity." "Jane?" "Well," she smoothed her skirt, "perhaps not entirely idle." Pugh set the pipe down. He was a careful man, a doctor's kind of careful. He chose words the way he chose treatments, considering what they might do as well as what they were meant to do. "Aubrey Finch," he said, "is a man who has spent 64 years being the most important person in every room he enters. Came into money early, inherited, not earned. That matters, I think, in a man's character. Things you don't earn, as you think you deserve. He's been generous to the church. Very. The roof fund was almost entirely him." A pause. "With conditions." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, which she had produced at some point without either of them quite noticing. "What kind of conditions?" "The specific kind, written down, which is a thing generous men don't usually do." Pugh picked up his pipe again, didn't light it, turned it over in his hands. "He wrote a letter to Haworth. I know because Haworth mentioned it to me in passing, the way he mentions things that trouble him. Finch was quite clear. The Christmas collection, all of it, to the Church Restoration Fund, not to outside charities, not to the orphanage in Hartwick. Here, the building." Miss Marple's needles clicked twice and stopped. Oh, and Gerald agreed. Howarth is not a confrontational man. No, she said, he isn't. He wrote back agreeing to it, he wrote back saying he'd take it under consideration, which Finch apparently read as agreement. And Howarth didn't correct him. Pugh finally lit the pipe. And then, from what I understand, he began writing this sermon, which is rather pointedly about the duty of the church to its most vulnerable, and the orphanage specifically needs £400 for the roof before January, or 200? What? The orphanage. They need £200, not 400. Pugh blinked. How do you know that? Mrs. Weatherby's daughter is on the board. She mentioned it at the flower show. Miss Marple looked out the window. But that's not the important part, Raymond. The important part is the letter. Or was there anything else in it beyond the donation condition? He was quiet for long enough that she looked back at him. I don't know, he said. Howarth didn't say, but there was... The way he spoke about it, the way he put it aside and talked about something else. He paused, like a man who has been reminded of something he'd rather not think about. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She looked at the fire again. Thank you, she said presently, for the coffee. You've barely touched it. No. She stood gathering her bag and her knitting with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has always carried too many things. But it was very good coffee. She found Agnes Holt at the church hall on Monday afternoon, and Agnes was there for the weekly mending circle. 4 women and occasionally 5 who came on Mondays to repair the kneeling cushions and the choir robes and whatever else the church produced in the way of things that needed stitching. Miss Marple went to the mending circle when her knee allowed it, which it did that Monday, and she sat next to Agnes without making a thing of it. Agnes was 24 or 26. Miss Marple was not entirely sure which. She had the kind of face that sat somewhere in that range and stayed there, round and pale and usually wearing an expression of mild worry that had probably been there since childhood. She worked part-time at the vicarage helping with correspondence, which Miss Marple had learned from the butcher's boy's mother's garden wall conversation and filed away in the part of her mind where useful facts lived quietly until they were needed. She was a quiet girl. Not shy exactly. She would speak when spoken to, and she had opinions. You could tell, but she kept them folded up inside herself like letters she'd written and decided not to send. Today, though, she seemed different. Not quiet. Still. Which isn't the same thing at all. Miss Marple stitched a torn hem on a choir robe and talked to Mrs. Fellows about whether the church hall could manage a proper craft table at the fete this year or whether it would block the cake display again. Agnes sat 2 seats down and sewed and didn't say much. Her needle, Miss Marple noticed, went into the fabric at slightly wrong angles. Not the angles of someone distracted, the angles of someone thinking so hard about something else that their hands had stopped communicating with their brain. When Mrs. Fellows went to make the tea and the other women drifted toward the biscuit table, Miss Marple moved her chair slightly and said, in the way she said things that were not accidents, gently, almost absently, "How is the Reverend getting on? I imagine it's been an unsettled week for him." Agnes's needle stopped. A second, 2. "He's all right," she said. "I think..." Such an important sermon to lose, all that work. Miss Marple shook her head. "Though I suppose it might be found." Agnes's hands were still in her lap now, folded around the robe. "Miss Marple," she said, and then stopped. "Yes, dear." The girl looked at the table, at her hands. Back up, briefly. And then away again. There was something building in her. Yes, you could see it, the way you see weather building on a flat horizon, still distant but coming. Her eyes had gone bright in the way eyes go bright when they are about to do something the rest of the face has not yet agreed to. "I saw something," she said, "at the vicarage. When I was helping with the correspondence." Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned, a long time ago that the most useful thing you can do when someone is about to tell you something important is to give them complete and total silence, like a room with all the furniture cleared out. People fill empty rooms. They can't help it. There was a letter, Agnes said. From Colonel Finch. I didn't mean to read it. It was in with the parish letters I was sorting. And I'd opened it before I saw it was personal, and then She stopped. I read it. Yes. It wasn't just about the donation. She was speaking quietly now. The other women still by the biscuit table, Mrs. Fellows clattering cups in the kitchen. There was something about... He mentioned a debt. An old one. He didn't say the amount. He said... She paused, trying to remember it exactly, the way people do when they know the words mattered. He said that he had always trusted that their arrangement was a matter of mutual understanding, and he hoped that remained the case. Mutual understanding. Miss Marple let the words sit in the air a moment. "Did you mention this to anyone?" she asked. Agnes's cheeks went very suddenly pink. At least it started at the jaw and moved upward, and she looked at the table again with an expression that answered the question before her mouth did. "I told Timothy," she said. "Mr. Featherstone. I was upset about it, and we talk, sometimes. We've been talking for a few weeks now. I find him easy to talk to." She said that last sentence carefully, with the specific care of someone who knows they are revealing more than the words contain, and knows the other person knows it too, and has decided to say it anyway. "He's a very pleasant young man," Miss Marple said, which was not quite the same thing as agreeing. "He said I shouldn't just worry about it." Agnes's voice had flattened slightly. "He said it wasn't my concern, that the Reverend and the Colonel had an arrangement, and it wasn't for us to—" She stopped again. Oh, he was very clear about it. "When did you have this conversation?" Agnes looked up, thought. "Thursday. The week before the folder went missing." A pause. "The Thursday before." Miss Marple nodded once and said no more about it, and asked Agnes instead how she was finding the winter, which was a question Agnes answered on autopilot while her eyes stayed slightly distant and her needle went back to the wrong angles. Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard. It was late afternoon. The particular late afternoon of November where the light goes without warning and suddenly everything is blue and cold and the shadows under the yew trees are very dark. The church itself was locked for the evening. She walked past the south door and the old Hartley tomb with the lichen growing over the lettering, and then the newer graves with their clean-edged stone. She walked slowly. Her knee was not bad today. She thought about Dorothy Howarth's hands. Folded, unfolding, folding again. The way they had moved when the study was mentioned. Not the startled movement of someone who has lost something, but the tightening movement of someone who is holding something down. She thought about Timothy Featherstone. His face when he'd seen her in the sitting room. The speed of his lie about Mrs. Armitage. The particular speed of it, no hesitation, no searching. The speed of a lie that has been prepared rather than invented. And what Agnes had said, he was very clear about it. Not concerned. Not curious. Clear. She thought about Gerald Howarth standing in his doorway looking at a desk that felt wrong. She thought, as she often did when a thing was beginning to take shape in her mind, of someone from the village. Not deliberately. It just came to her. The way a word comes when you've been trying to remember it and stopped trying. Mrs. Foster. 20 years ago nearly. Her husband Douglas had run up debts, not gambling, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary slow disaster of a man who spent more than he had and told his wife less than she deserved. The Fosters had borrowed from old Mr. Clement, not a bank, not officially, the kind of loan that lives in a handshake and grows complicated. When Douglas died, the debt came to Clara Foster, and Mr. Clement, who had always seemed a decent man, who brought vegetables from his allotment and asked after her children, had reminded her of it, once, gently, only in a way that was not quite a threat because it didn't need to be. Clara had gone very quiet. She had started selling furniture. Small things first, then larger. She had never once told anyone what she was doing or why. Miss Marple had worked it out, eventually. But by then the damage was done. By then Clara had hollowed herself out, keeping a secret that had started as someone else's shame and ended as hers. The things people protect, Miss Marple thought, stepping over a root on the path. They're never quite the right things. A debt. Old enough to have been almost forgotten. The kind that a decent man, and Gerald Howarth was a decent man, genuinely, would have perhaps mentioned to his wife in a quiet moment, and she would have folded it away in the part of herself that held all the things she could not fix. For how many years? Living with it. And then a letter from Finch and a sermon that would undo whatever careful silence they had built around it. And a wife who had done what wives do when they love someone too much and think too little about whether they have the right. She took the folder, Miss Marple thought. Dorothy took it. Not Featherstone. Dorothy. But Featherstone had known it would happen. He had... what was the word? He had arranged for it to happen without arranging it. He had put the idea in the room and left it there and let it do its work. And then he had given himself an alibi for an afternoon when no alibi was needed because there was no crime. Because crimes need evidence and evidence needs bodies, and here there were only two frightened women and a young man who understood leverage the way some people understand music, naturally, i.e. without having to be taught. The church clock struck 5. Miss Marple stood still for a moment in the churchyard. The cold settled around her. Then she went home and made herself dinner and watched the last of the light go from the sky above her garden, and she thought that tomorrow she would call on Colonel Finch. Colonel Aubrey Finch lived in the largest house on Minster Road. This was not an accident. He had bought it specifically because it was the largest house on Minster Road, and anyone who knew him understood that, and anyone who didn't know him learned it fairly quickly. The house was called Aes Ishenden. It had gates. Not a gate, gates, plural, wrought iron, with the kind of hinges that announce themselves when you push them open, a sound like a minor declaration of war. Miss Marple pushed them open on Tuesday morning and walked up the gravel drive at a pace that suggested she had been invited. She had not been invited. The maid who answered the door, young, a bit flustered, clearly new to the job, looked uncertain about what to do with a small elderly lady in a grey wool coat who smiled pleasantly and said she had a parish matter to discuss with the Colonel. Miss Marple had found, over many decades, that the phrase parish matter opened a remarkable number of doors. People didn't like to say no to the parish. It felt vaguely like saying no to God, without the theological commitment. She was shown to the morning room. It was a cold room. Not for lack of heating. There was a fire going, a good one, but cold the way certain rooms are cold regardless, because the person who lives in them has furnished them for impressing people rather than for living in. Everything was the right thing in the right place. The paintings were good. The chairs were good. The flowers on the sideboard were fresh and completely symmetrical, which flowers are not naturally, and someone had worked to make them so. She sat and waited. Finch kept her waiting 12 minutes. She counted. Not because she was impatient, she wasn't, but because the length of time a man makes you wait tells you something about how he thinks about you. 12 minutes was the gap between not important enough to hurry and important enough to see at all. She filed it away. He came in looking the way he always looked, large, well-pressed, with a face that had been handsome 30 years ago and hadn't quite accepted the situation. He was 64 or 66. She couldn't recall precisely. There was a heartiness about him, the performed kind. The kind men use when they want to fill a room before anyone else can. Miss Marple. He didn't quite smile. Nearly. What a pleasant surprise. How kind of you to see me, Colonel. I won't take much of your time. He sat. He looked at her with the expression men like him wear when they look at women like her. Polite, slightly impatient, and fundamentally unworried. She was a small old lady with a shopping bag and a kind face. There was nothing there to worry about. That was, she had always found, a considerable advantage. I wanted to speak with you, she said, about the Christmas collection. A small shift. Very small. Oh? Only because I've been asked to help organise the parish fete committee this year. And there's been some, well, confusion about where the funds are going. You know how villages are. She shook her head with gentle despair at the folly of villages. People talk. Mrs. Price at the post office had quite the wrong end of the stick, I think, suggesting that the collection wouldn't go to the orphanage in Hartwick this year. Which, of course, can't be right. The Reverend Haworth has spoken of nothing else for months. Finch's expression did not change, almost. These things are between myself and Haworth, he said, smooth, even. I'm sure it'll all be sorted out. Oh, I'm sure it will. Miss Marple opened her bag and appeared to look for something she didn't find, which gave her a reason to look down for a moment and then look back up. It's only... You know how people talk, Colonel, especially in a village this size. And letters, well, letters have a way of finding their way about, don't they? People mention things. To their sisters, to their doctors. And of course, once a thing is mentioned, she made a soft sound, half sigh, half smile. One can't really unmention it. A beat. The fire crackled. Finch looked at her. She looked back pleasantly the way she always looked at everything, open, unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world and found it all very interesting. I have always, he said carefully, been a great supporter of this church. You have, enormously so, everyone says so. And I expect that support to continue. A pause. Naturally. Naturally. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her coat. And I'm sure the Reverend Haworth's sermon will reflect that. He speaks so well about generosity, doesn't he? The real kind. The kind that doesn't keep a ledger. She smiled at him with complete warmth. I'm so glad we had this little chat. She left. Walking back down the gravel drive, she heard the iron gates behind her and felt the morning air on her face, sharp and clean after the closed-in warmth of that room, and thought, that will do it. Or it won't. And if it won't, she'd think of something else. But she thought it would. Men like Finch understood one currency above all others, and it wasn't money. It was the threat of being seen clearly. She had shown him that she saw him clearly. She was fairly certain he'd got the message. Featherstone was harder, not because he was cleverer. She didn't think on reflection that he was particularly clever, only that he was quick, which people often confuse. Because he was quick and he was smooth, and he believed with the absolute confidence of a young man who'd been told he was charming since childhood, that charm was a kind of armour, that if he smiled in the right way and said the right things and kept moving, nothing would quite catch up with him. She found him in the vestry on Wednesday afternoon. He was arranging something on the small table by the window. Hymn books, she thought, though he straightened them very suddenly when she came in, and she wondered if he'd been doing something else entirely. Miss Marple. He was pleased, or performing pleased, which was the thing with him. What a nice... I wonder if I might have a word, Mr. Featherstone. Something went through his face. It was quick, and he recovered well, but it was there. Of course. She didn't sit. Neither did he. On they stood in the small cold vestry with its smell of candle wax and damp stone, and outside the wind had picked up and was doing something melancholy to the elm trees, and Miss Marple looked at the curate and felt, not satisfaction, not quite. Something more like tiredness. The specific tiredness that comes from watching a young person do the wrong thing with every advantage available to them. You know why I'm here, she said. Not a question. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he tried the smile. I'm not sure that I—" "You suggested to Dorothy Howarth," Miss Marple said quietly, "that the sermon notes might be made to disappear for a while. You did this after Agnes told you about Colonel Finch's letter. You did this because you thought it would prevent a conflict that might embarrass the parish, or perhaps because you thought it would put you in a favourable position with the Colonel, or, and I think this is perhaps closest, was because you didn't want complications in your first posting, and a confrontation between the vicar and the church warden would have been rather a large complication." Featherstone's face had gone through several things in rapid succession. "I didn't steal anything," he said. His voice was different now. The smoothness had come off it like paint in the rain. "I didn't touch the folder." "No, you didn't." "Then that isn't the same as being innocent, Mr. Featherstone." She said it simply, without drama, without anger. The way you say a true thing when you've known it long enough that emotion has finished with it. You knew that Dorothy Howarth was frightened. You understood the situation. She told you through Agnes. And Agnes trusted you, which is a thing worth noticing, what people do with trust when it's given to them. A pause. You planted the idea. You left it with her. And then you went away and let her carry it. He was very still. Outside the wind again. A branch somewhere scraping stone. I thought... He stopped. Tried again. The Reverend wouldn't have wanted... The sermon, the things in it, they would have caused so much trouble for everyone. For you, Miss Marple said. Mainly for you. He flinched. It was a small flinch, but it was real, and she genuinely thought that somewhere underneath the quickness and the charm and the performed pleasantness, there was something still capable of shame, which was something at least. It was not nothing. "I'm not going to the police," she said. "There is no crime here. It's only a great unkindness." She looked at him steadily. "You are going to be a vicar, Mr. Featherstone. You are going to stand in front of people at the worst moments of their lives, when they have lost someone, or lost their way, or lost faith in the idea that things can be all right, and they will trust you." She picked up her bag. "I'd think carefully about whether you want to deserve that." He didn't say anything. She left him there, in the cold vestry. Dorothy Howarth opened the door before she knocked. She must have seen her coming up the path. She had the look of someone who had been waiting. Not today, perhaps not even this week, but waiting in the longer sense. The way people wait when they know eventually a thing will have to be faced. "Jane," she said. "Just that." Dorothy." Miss Marple looked at her friend, because they were friends, had been for many years, the kind of quiet, sustained friendship between women of a certain age who don't need to perform it, and felt the tiredness again, but softer this time. "May I come in?" The kitchen. Not the sitting room this time. They sat at the kitchen table, which was better. The sitting room was for guests, the kitchen was for truth. There was a smell of something baking, an automatic smell, the kind that happens when hands need to do something while the mind is elsewhere. Dorothy sat with her hands flat on the table. Not folded now, just flat. Open. "You know," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know." Miss Marple sat down across from her. "The coal cellar, I think." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were very bright. But not weeping. Not yet. That particular brightness that is the last stage before weeping, when the body is considering whether or not to. Behind the loose brick, yes. She looked at the table. "I couldn't destroy it. I tried. I got as far as the kitchen stove with it, and I just couldn't. It's 40 years of him. In that folder. His handwriting, he keeps ticket stubs in there from places we've been. There's a piece of the lace from my wedding veil he put in years ago. I don't even know why. He never said why." She stopped. Her hands pressed flat against the table. "The debt," she said. "Finch's letter. Gerald wrote that sermon not knowing what it would do. He's forgotten, I think." Not entirely, but he doesn't feel the weight of it the way I do. He wrote it because he believed it, every word. Oh, and he would have delivered it, and Finch would have—" She pressed her lips together. "We are not young, Jane. We are not young, and we have very little, and I could not—" "I know," Miss Marple said again. "I wasn't going to keep it forever. I was going to—" Her voice broke, just slightly, like a thin piece of wood under weight. "I was going to talk to him. Tell him. Ask him to take out the parts about— But every time I tried, I just couldn't find the words. Because how do you tell a good man that you've stolen his—" She stopped again. The oven made a small ticking sound. Somewhere outside, a bird. "You're going to get the folder," Miss Marple said gently, "and you're going to give it to Gerald, tonight, and you're going to tell him. Not everything if you don't want to, but enough. Because he will forgive you, Dorothy. You know he will." "That's the worst part," Dorothy said, very quietly. "That's exactly the worst part." She got up. She went to the door to the coal cellar at the back of the kitchen. It opened with a scrape of old wood on stone, the smell of coal dust and cold. And she was gone for a moment, and when she came back she was holding a leather folder with a cracked edge and a broken clasp. Dusty, slightly cobwebbed, entirely intact. She set it on the table. They both looked at it. "There's a button in my apron pocket," Dorothy said suddenly. "Gerald's been missing it for 3 months." Miss Marple looked at her, and then, for the first time in 3 days, she thought, Dorothy Howarth laughed. It was a very small laugh, quickly over and slightly damp around the edges. But it was real. "I'll put the kettle on," Miss Marple said. "Old Gerald Howarth was in his study when Dorothy came in with the folder. He was sitting at his desk, not working, just sitting the way he'd been sitting most evenings that week, looking at the space where it had been. He had started rewriting the sermon from memory 3 days ago and had managed 4 pages before stopping because it wasn't right. It wasn't the same. 22 years of a man's thinking doesn't reproduce itself from memory, not exactly. And the 4 pages he'd written felt like a copy of something rather than the thing itself. Like a photograph of a garden. The shape was there. The life wasn't. He looked up when Dorothy came in. She stood in the doorway. She was holding the folder with both hands, the way you hold something you are simultaneously relieved to be putting down and not yet ready to let go of. Her face was— It was difficult to say what her face was doing exactly. It was doing several things at once, which faces do when people have been carrying something for too long and have finally decided to set it down. "I found it," she said. Gerald looked at the folder, then at his wife. He didn't say anything for a moment. His eyes moved over her face with the slow attention of a man who has looked at the same face for 40 years and still finds it legible in ways that nothing else is. "Dorothy," he said, "don't." Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to make it so, you could tell. "Just let me say it first. Let me say all of it, and then you can— Whatever you want to say, you can say it after." She told him. Not everything. She left out Featherstone, which was perhaps not the right choice, but was a human one. The choice of a woman who understood that her husband would find it harder to forgive a young man's calculation than his wife's fear. She told him about the letter, about Finch's debt reminder, the old money, the mutual understanding, about standing in the kitchen holding the folder and not being able to put it in the stove, about the coal cellar. Gerald listened. He sat very still. His hands were on the desk, folded. There was that word again. Miss Marple would have noticed the same word, and he watched his wife's face and did not interrupt. When she finished, the room was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece went on doing what clocks do. "I've been carrying it," Dorothy said. "The Finch thing. I've been carrying it since the letter came, and I didn't. You'd forgotten about it, or nearly. Austin, I thought if I said something, it would only—" She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. "I was trying to protect you, which I know. I know that's not—" "Come here," Gerald said. She crossed the room. He took her hands, both of them the way he had taken them at the altar 40 years ago, same hands, thinner now, the rings looser. And he held them and didn't say anything clever or theological or wise. He just held them. For a long time. "You should have told me," he said eventually, into her hair, very quiet. "I know. I'm not angry. I know that too." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's been the problem all along, Gerald. I have never once been able to stay frightened of you." Miss Marple heard about it the next morning from nobody because nobody knew. She simply assumed it had gone that way. Well, because she knew Dorothy Howarth, and she knew Gerald Howarth, and she knew what 40 years of a good marriage looks like from the outside, which is not perfection, but something sturdier and more interesting than perfection. She got on with her week. The cold snap, as predicted, showed no signs of lifting. Her kitchen pipes were worrying her. The blue cardigan was nearly finished, just the left sleeve to go. She wrote 2 letters, one to her nephew Raymond, one to a friend in Lymington who had been unwell. She attended the Mothers' Union meeting on Thursday where Mrs. Price announced that the vicar had recovered his sermon notes, which had apparently been misfiled, and wasn't that a relief? And everyone agreed it was, misfiled. Miss Marple drank her tea and agreed it was a relief and said nothing else. And on Friday she had a brief conversation with Colonel Finch at the post office. He was buying stamps. She was posting Raymond's letter. They exchanged the usual remarks about the weather and the roadworks on the Long Dean Road, and as they moved toward the door, Finch said, with the particular casualness of a man choosing his words very carefully indeed, "I've been thinking about the Christmas collection, Miss Marple. It occurs to me that the orphanage in Hartwick does excellent work. Excellent work. I shall be making a separate personal contribution, I think, quite apart from the church fund." "How very generous," Miss Marple said. "Well," he held the door open for her. "One likes to do what one can." He walked away toward the high street, back straight, step measured, looking for all the world like a man who had arrived at a charitable impulse entirely on his own. Miss Marple watched him go. She thought about Featherstone. Not constantly, but she thought about him. The way you think about a thing when you're not sure you've left it properly settled. She saw him at Sunday service. She saw everyone at Sunday service. St. Mary Mead being the kind of village where church attendance was less about faith and more about not wanting to be the person who didn't go, and he was composed, attentive, said the right things in the right order. He helped old Mr. Caswell to his pew without being asked. He talked to the Weatherby children with a genuine warmth that surprised her slightly. After the service, as people gathered at the door in the thin winter sunlight, he appeared at her side. "Miss Marple," he said. Well, she looked at him. He wasn't performing, she thought, or not entirely. There was something different in his face today. Not contrite, exactly. Contrition wears itself on the outside like a badge. This was something quieter. Something that hadn't finished yet. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said." "Good," she said simply. He seemed to want to say more. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I told myself I was being practical, that I was preventing, that it would have been worse, the confrontation, the—" "Yes," she said, "we usually do." He looked at her. "Tell ourselves that," she said, "when we do something for our own comfort and need it to be something else." A pause, longer than comfortable. "I'm going to talk to Mrs. Howarth," he said. "I don't know. I'm not sure what to say." "Oh, but I think I should say something." Miss Marple considered him for a moment. The young face, the uncertainty in it, the effort that uncertainty was costing him. She thought of all the men she had known who had calcified at 30 into permanent smoothness, who had made the lie about themselves so often it became true, who had never stood in a cold November churchyard and admitted to an old woman that they had been selfish, small men, comfortable men. Not wicked exactly, just permanently small. Featherstone was not there yet, might not get there. Might. "She will appreciate it," Miss Marple said. "I think," he nodded. "Once, and walked away, and she watched him go with the feeling she always had at these moments. Not satisfaction, not quite, but something in that family. The feeling of a window opened in a stuffy room. The air moving again. Christmas morning came grey and sharp and smelling of frost. Miss Marple walked to church early because she liked it before the others arrived. The quietness of the building in the half-dark, the candles lit but the pews empty, the smell of cold stone and pine and the beeswax Mrs. Cranshaw used on the woodwork every December. She took her usual seat near the back to the left of the centre aisle, third pew from the end. She had sat in this spot for 30 years. The wood was familiar under her hands the way few things are familiar when you have touched something so many times that it has become part of the texture of your life. She watched people come in, Mrs. Price in her good hat, the Weatherbys with their 3 children, the youngest already looking mischievous, Dr. Pugh, and who caught her eye and raised an eyebrow a fraction, which was his way of asking if anything interesting had happened, and she gave the smallest shake of her head, which was her way of saying later, old Mr. Caswell, helped in by Featherstone, who settled him in the front left pew and said something that made the old man laugh. Agnes Holt came in and sat toward the middle. She looked better than she had at the mending circle, less still. Her hands, when she took off her gloves, were steady. Colonel Finch came in at 5 to 11. Front pew, right side, as always. He did not look at anyone particularly. His back was, as always, very straight. Then Gerald Howarth came through from the vestry, and Dorothy behind him. And Dorothy looked, Miss Marple thought, like a woman who had slept properly for the first time in several weeks. Not happy exactly. Settled. The way the ground looks after rain has finally come. The sermon was everything it was supposed to be. Gerald Howarth was not a dramatic preacher. He never had been. It wasn't his nature. His nature was quiet and careful and deeply sincere. The kind of sincerity that you don't question because it has no performance in it. He spoke about duty, about the difference between generosity that serves the giver and generosity that serves the given. He told a story about a woman he'd known in his first parish 35 years ago who had nothing, genuinely nothing, lived in 2 rooms above a bakery with 4 children and a husband who was mostly absent, and who had every Christmas pressed coins into the collection tin for the local children's home, not because she could afford to, but because she said that when you gave from what you couldn't spare, you understood something about giving that comfort never taught you. He talked about the orphanage in Hartwick, specifically, the roof, the cost, the children who would spend the winter in a building that was cold because no one had bothered to care enough. His voice was steady throughout. It didn't waver, didn't reach for effect. It just said what it had to say with the plain directness of a man who has spent a long time deciding what he believes and has stopped feeling the need to dress it up. Miss Marple looked at the folder on the lectern, that battered old thing, its cracked leather and its broken clasp. 22 years on a desk. She thought about what Dorothy had said, the ticket stubs, the piece of wedding lace, the whole quiet accumulation of a life. It kept together in a thing that didn't close properly. She looked at Dorothy Howarth in the front pew. Dorothy was looking at her husband. Just looking. Nothing else. The collection. £342. Miss Marple happened to know this because Mrs. Price knew the sidesman who counted it, and told Mrs. Hartwell, who mentioned it to Miss Hartnell, who phoned Miss Marple on Boxing Day morning with what she called simply the figure, in the tone of a woman delivering a satisfying verdict. Colonel Finch's contribution in the plate, she didn't know the exact amount, but the sidesman had mentioned it was a large note. And separate from that, his personal cheque to the orphanage which the Reverend Howarth had apparently received by post on the 23rd. The amount of that cheque was not shared around the village, which was itself unusual because amounts were usually shared around the village, and Miss Marple suspected the reason it wasn't was because it was large enough that Even by St. Mary Mead's standards, it would have caused comment. Men like Finch, she thought. When they decided to do a thing, they did it thoroughly. It was the one quality she had always found in them, and the one she was glad of in the end. She had Raymond and his wife Joan for Christmas dinner, which was noisy and pleasant and involved a great deal of washing up, which Raymond did with the focused concentration of a man who prefers tasks with clear beginnings and ends. Joan helped Miss Marple put the good plates away afterward, and they talked about the children who were growing and Joan's sister who was getting married in the spring. It was a good evening, later, when Raymond and Joan had gone and the house was quiet and the fire was low and her knitting was in her lap. Miss Marple sat in the silence and thought about the year going out and the new one coming, as she always did at Christmas, in the way that wasn't quite sad and wasn't quite glad, but was something honest about the passage of time. She thought about Dorothy and Gerald Haworth in their vicarage across the churchyard. She hoped they were warm. She thought about Agnes Holt. She rather thought that situation with Featherstone would sort itself out, one way or the other, and either way Agnes would be all right. She had more sense than she looked, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, the best kind of sense to have. She thought about Timothy Featherstone. She hoped she'd been right about him. She thought she had. But she had been wrong before. She picked up her knitting. The left sleeve was nearly done. She met Dr. Pugh for sherry on the 27th. His sitting room, the usual chairs, the pipe tobacco smell. Mrs. Bolt had made small sandwiches that nobody ate. The afternoon light came in sideways and grey through the curtains and lay across the carpet in long pale strips. "Well," Pugh said when they'd covered Christmas and the weather and Mrs. Bantry's cousin in Devonshire, who was finding it even more agreeable in winter, apparently. "Are you going to tell me?" Miss Marple looked at her sherry. "Tell you what, Raymond?" He gave her the look he reserved for this specific circumstance, which was a look of resigned fondness. The sermon notes, the whole business. He picked up his pipe. Well, Price says they were misfiled." "So she says. And you had nothing to do with any of it?" "I had blackcurrant jam to deliver," Miss Marple said. "And I was helping with the fete committee. You know how busy it gets at this time of year." Pugh made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The collection was over £300, he said. "Yes." "Haworth looked well, I thought, at Christmas service. Dorothy too." "They're a good pair," Miss Marple said. Simply. Outside, a car passed on the road. A dog somewhere. The fire settled. "In my experience," Miss Marple said after a moment, not quite to Pugh, not quite to herself, the way you say things when you've been thinking them long enough that they've finished being thoughts and become something else. The things people steal are never quite what they're frightened of losing. It's always something else entirely. Pugh looked at her. "The folder," he said slowly, wasn't the thing." "No," she set down her sherry glass. "It never was." Outside the light was going, the early dark of late December settling over St. Mary Mead with its usual patient indifference. The street lamp on Minster Road came on. Somewhere the church clock began to strike 4. Miss Marple picked up the last inch of the blue cardigan. Her needles clicked in the quiet. And that, as far as St. Mary Mead was concerned, was that. The end.